So guys, what if Naruto met Karin and had Unforeseen Night Harem Part 1? Karin sat in the room in which the first phase of the chunin exams was to take place, barely containing her nervousness. She had been sick twice the night before, and had been unable to eat breakfast. It was quite the contrast from the excitement that had carried her all the way to Konoha from Kusagakure. All of a sudden, the blonde in orange who looked small enough to be mistaken for a 10-year-old, and probably was one now that she thought about it, started claiming to be an Uzumaki. That was too much. She who was amongst the last of the Uzumaki wouldn't let this little liar claim to be a member of that great clan. And therefore family to her. It was clear as the hair on the brat's head that he wasn't an Uzumaki. All Uzumaki were redheads. It was a trait that was strangely dominant in all Uzumaki, non-Uzumaki pairings, despite the fact that red hair was usually a recessive trait. If the brat wanted to claim to belong to one of the great clans, he may as well claim to be a Uchiha, as that claim had equal chances of being true, meaning none at all. She wouldn't sit still for this. Liar! She yelled, catching the attention of the entire room as she stormed towards the boy, prepared to kill him for his insult. I will not let a little blonde loudmouthed shrimp like you sully my clan's name by claiming it for your own. It was at that point in which Uchiha Sasuke, who if had kept his mouth shut and saved her from a bear in the forest later in the exam would have earned her undying love and gratitude, put his foot in his mouth and earned something else entirely. You mean there's an entire clan of you morons? Sasuke yelled. As Karin stood there looking back and forth between the false Uzumaki and the dark-haired punk who was obviously his teammate trying to decide which one to kill first, the proctors appeared. Settle down. The lead proctor barked. Unfortunately, the entire room, which had been stirred up by the claim of name theft, wasn't in the mood to settle since there was most likely going to be a killing soon. Name theft was one of the lowest acts one could commit in the shinobi world, and clans tended to deal harshly with those who tried to use their name when they weren't entitled to it. I said settle down, the lead proctor roared. Internal clan matters take precedent to all others within the village walls. It's in the founding charter, Hyuga Neji spoke up. Yes, and that means that the members of said clan can get the hell out of here. The lead proctor said, before turning and throwing out as an afterthought their teams too. Great going Naruto, if you hadn't tried to show off we'd be taking the exam right now. Uchiha Sasuke snarled at his teammate as the team from Konoha and the team from Grass filed out of the room grumbling over the actions of their respective teammates. As Karin was gearing up to fight and kill the blonde fake on the lawn of Konoha's ninja academy, the copy nin Hitaki Kakashi who shed read about when she stole her sensei's bingo book arrived, presumably to have a word with his students who had just been thrown out of the exam. What's going on here? The Hitaki asked as he took in the impending duel. The red-haired girl here is claiming that Naruto committed an act of name theft, the pink-haired female on the fake and the Uchiha Punks team said, looking as if she wouldn't put it past the fake. Oh, who was he claiming to be related to? The Hitaki asked, looking at the fake sternly. My clan, she roared as she lunged towards the boy only to be restrained by the Hitaki. There's no way in hell that this blonde shrimp is an Uzumaki. There's unimpeachable proof of Naruto's lineage going back several generations, the Hitaki said coldly. What proof do you offer for your claim that you are Uzumaki? But, he's blonde. No Uzumaki are blonde, she said weakly as the Hitaki loosened his grip on her upon realizing the fight had just gone out of her. His father's genes turned out to be more dominant in some areas. He's got the habanero's personality though, much to my regret, the Hitaki said as he released her. She ended up sitting down hard when he did. She had family in Konoha. She had family in a freaking foreign country. As she sat there dumbly staring off into space as the realization sank in, the blonde who had a round face that she realized was similar to those of some of her relatives, and her own to a degree now that she got a closer look and had time to take it in, walked up to her, studying her with a strange intensity. I have family, the boy whispered almost in awe. So, are you like a cousin or something? The boy asked as he sat down next to her. Both genin started talking to each other, completely oblivious to exactly how far they had just derailed Orochimaru's plans, and to the fact that Karin's life had just completely changed. Naruto had sat on the lawn outside the academy talking to Karin until the sun set, and had treated her to a bowl of ramen at Ichiraku's when they'd both grown hungry upon realizing that they'd missed both lunch and dinner. When Naruto had told Tsuki about Karin being related to him, The man said something about her looking a bit like his mother before paling and rapidly clamming up. After several minutes of crying, Chuki had looked at him sadly and said, "I am sorry, Naruto, but your parents somehow got included in that law. I think it was to keep the people who didn't know who they were from bad-mouthing them for having you in front of you," but, before clamming up once again. "You mean that Kakashi-sensei could get in trouble for talking about them?" he asked, horrified by the prospect that his sensei could get hurt or maybe even killed for saying as much as he had. He now knew that his mother was named Habanero, but at what price had that information come? Realizing that he wasn't in the mood for ramen anymore, he left his third bowl half finished as he paid for his and his cousin's meal, idly noting that his cousin had eaten just as much as he had. He decided to head over to the Hokage Tower to speak with the old man before he retired for the day. He didn't want Kakashi-sensei or Chuki-san to get hurt just because they said something about his parents. That part of the law that made people keep quiet about the Kyuubi was just stupid. And Karin smiled when Naruto dropped her off at the inn she was staying at after walking, or rather hurrying her home. Back to her lodgings. The boy was nice if somewhat stupid, and possessed a stupendous amount of chakra. She would have to write home about the boy, and ask if anyone knew about any Uzumaki in Konoha, while having family in a foreign country was just asking for trouble, and possible charges of treason if she kept in contact. She couldn't find it in herself not to acknowledge her kin, if she could lure the boy away from Konoha. She would have to look to see exactly how distantly they were related. If they weren't too close, she could use him to help raise the numbers of their dwindling clan and bring them back to the greatness they once had before their home was destroyed. It was when she ran into her sensei that she was brought back down to earth. "Karin," the man said coldly, "trust you to mess something as simple as a chunin exam up. Your little outburst ruined everything for your team." She whimpered as she took in the expressions on her teammates' faces. This wasn't going to be good. Back so soon? Haruno Sakura's mother asked as her daughter came into the house looking completely dejected. "Naruto ruined everything," Sakura cried. "What did that little monster do?" "Mrs. Haruno asked her daughter as she grabbed a box Sakura's favorite sweets in order to comfort the girl. Naruto started yelling crap to look like a tough guy, and some redhead girl from Kusagakure didn't believe he was an Uzumaki and tried starting a fight, and we all got kicked out. Sakura wailed. "I knew that brat couldn't possibly be an Uzumaki." "Mrs. Haruno yelled almost victoriously. She now had the scoop of the year. The sins of the lady down the street were nothing compared to this. "He is," Sakura said. "Kakashi-sensei said so. He said that there was proof of Naruto's lineage going back generations." "But why hasn't anyone?" "Oh, dear," Mrs. Haruno said, looking as if she was suddenly lost in her own little world. "He does look like him, and I remember overhearing my mother saying, 'Oh, dear.'" "What is it, mother?" Sakura asked. "Oh, long before you were born. There were rumors of a scandal involving the honorable grandson, the first honorable grandson, Senju Nawaki not Sarutobi Kanahomaru, and a girl that was 2 years older than him. They were hushed up after the poor boy died on one of his first missions, since at the age of 12 he was obviously too young and it would be shameful to drag the poor boy's name through mud after he had died for Konoha. But I wonder if they hadn't been silenced too soon," Mrs. Haruno said. Yes, that would be about right. He of course would have been a bit young. No older than 20, but it does fit. The Senju genes were just about the only thing in nature that could dominate the Uzumaki Red. Tsunade and Nawaka's father was proof of that. No wonder they kept it a secret. A scandal like that, Mrs. Haruno muttered to herself as she wandered off into her own world where she was preparing the ultimate bit of gossip about a certain Uzumaki child. She'd have all of her neighbors eating out of her hand by the end of the week. As Naruto slept, Karin was admitted to the local hospital after being beaten by her instructor and teammates for her part in the chunin exams debacle, having been brought there by her irate team who had only narrowly voted for her to not be left to die. The reason for her survival had more to do with maintaining Kusagakure's reputation in the international scene than it did any affection her teammates may have had for Karin as a person. As the medics worked on Karin, Hitaki Kakashi was being debriefed about the events surrounding the disqualification of his team before the first phase had even started. "I did not refer to either of Naruto's parents by name," Kakashi replied to a question that had been asked by Kaharu. "I did however use one of his mother's common titles." The interrogation lasted long into the night, and in the end, Kakashi had been given permission to inform Naruto that his parents' names had been classified, and for good reason, and to give Naruto small tidbits of information about his parents and family history, including where the Uzumaki clan had come from and what had happened to them. Shortly after sunrise, though she didn't need anything in particular, Sakura's mother set out to do some early morning shopping. What Shed actually intended was to get some early morning gossip in the marketplace while the incident from the chunin exams was fresh in people's minds. The Uchiha's disqualification had undoubtedly made the rounds by now. As she moved towards one of the produce stalls that were still being set up, she heard the outraged whispers about the Uzumaki boy that were her cue. Actually, it was the foreign girl's fault, Sakura's mother said, in a choice between sticking it to the demon or sticking it to a foreigner. The foreigner won out. The demon was a native of Konoha. Sort of, especially if you consider the fact that its vessel was native Konoha citizen born from a prominent bloodline, and Konoha could do no wrong, especially when there were foreigners about. How do you figure that? One of the women down the street whom she absolutely despised asked snidely. I got the story out of my daughter last night, she replied sweetly. Apparently, the Uzumaki boy had been trying to intimidate the other participants in the exam in hopes of giving himself and his team a better chance, and the foreign girl called his lineage into question. Well, considering the fact that no one actually knows, one of the other women in the group started. It's less a case of no one knows, and more of a case of it being so scandalous that it had to be hidden, dear, she said with a satisfied smile on her face that called to mind metaphors about cats, canaries, and the consumption thereof. My daughter heard her teacher say that there is proof of the boy's lineage going back generations. The only reason it would be hidden would be if. If what? One of the younger women who had only recently been allowed into the circle after her marriage asked eagerly. Think about it. Whose line was the only one known to have actually drowned out the Uzumaki Red? Who managed to produce a brunette son, and a dark blonde granddaughter and grandson? She asked, noting with glee that she had everyone wrapped around her finger. But, someone would have noticed long ago if Tsunade came up pregnant, and any child she would have had either white, black, dark brown, or blue hair, one of the other women replied. I am sure one of you will remember that old rumor I remember my mother speaking about when I was a little girl, she said, getting a subtle dig in at one of the older members of the group she was gossiping with on this fine morning, the one that got rather hastily buried after the poor boy died. You mean that nasty lie about Naoki and that little slut that Iwa was trying to spread? One of the women hissed. Based on the looks that comment got, she was in very dangerous territory, and she was tap dancing on the edge. If she didn't move carefully, she could be pushed over and shunned, or worse. It was fortunate for her in the sake of the truth that the demon bore a bit of a resemblance to Naoki, a resemblance that some members of the group would undoubtedly try to wave away as part of their shared Uzumaki heritage. Come now. I told you it would be scandalous, she said in a false light tone. You have to admit it makes sense. Any child Naoki would have been about 20 around the time that the Uzumaki was born, which is more than old enough to father a child, and the Uzumaki does bear something of a resemblance to the Shodai Hokage's grandson. The other women, a couple of whom were kunoichi and a few more who were retired kunoichi, all put up a stony front, but she could see the considering looks in their eyes. It could take a couple of minutes before she found out whether or not Shed just fatally overstepped her bounds, or provided the best item of gossip in years. He sure does act like him sometimes, a middle-aged woman who had actually gone to the academy with Naoki finally said, breaking the silence. It also explains why Hokage-sama is so fond of him, and why even Danzo had been upset when there were calls for his execution early on. That story about him having some sort of unholy mind control power is obviously bullshit. He'd be in charge of the village otherwise. Mrs. Haruno breathed a sigh of relief when a second woman joined in, an elderly woman who had once met the Shodai Hokage when she was a child. Apparently, this woman could now see what had hit her like a ton of bricks the night before, after she'd been informed by her daughter that the Uzumaki child's parentage was unknown, not because nobody knew who they were, but because the higher-ups in charge of the village were deliberately hiding their identities. As the women gossiped, spreading incorrect information about Naruto's heritage around the village, Naruto went to his cousin's lodgings where he learned that his cousin was in the hospital, After he was stared at by a nurse who was looking at him as if she'd never seen him before, despite the fact that she'd been the one to give him his immunizations before the academy for more than 5 minutes, he was led into Karin's room. When he learned how and why his cousin was in the hospital in the first place, he saw red, as the villagers watched Naruto deal with those who had harmed his newfound family whom he already considered precious to him. They winced as they remembered all of the things they had done which could have, and had indeed upset the boy. They all found themselves glad that they hadn't been the ones to finally make him snap. They'd all intellectually known that the demon was there, but they had pretty much forgotten in a way as well, since Naruto had never gone on a murderous rampage before now, and had pretty much limited himself to stupid and sometimes destructive pranks. As Naruto tore through a foreign genin team, and quite likely caused an international incident that would take a great number of compromises to resolve, the Hokage sighed in relief over the fact that the team that Naruto had attacked had been from one of the minor villages rather than from one of the Big Five. The Big Five being the villages located in each of the elemental countries. If it had been one of the Big Five, there would likely be a declaration of war in his inbox before the day was out. If he was lucky, Kusugakure, being a small village, would probably want to forget that this had ever happened, especially if he spun it so that it looked like the team from Kusa had deliberately provoked Konoha's Jinchuriki. Everyone knew that doing something like that was suicide, and generally didn't have pity for the idiots who did so. Head sent Kakashi out to help calm Naruto down when the first panicked reports came in. Kakashi would know how to deal with this as, according to the mission report from Wave, Naruto had exhibited similar behavior before. Jiraiya, who had dropped by with the intention of training Naruto, would undoubtedly help out in the situation, as otherwise, training the boy may no longer be an option. Hiruzen felt like slamming his head on his desk when his little council of advisors came racing into the room. Them, and Danzo who was trailing behind them, were the absolute last thing he needed right now. In the village proper, villagers were doing a wide variety of activities which ranged from pissing themselves to holing up in a corner and praying that the situation didn't become worse. All of them, however, were also remembering slights made against a certain blonde boy and silently vowing to never do such things, or anything else that might provoke him again. Up until now, the Uzumaki had been tolerant and forgiving, taking all of their abuse and begging for the merest scrap of attention in return. He wasn't doing so now. Everyone who had been there would remember how Naruto had stormed from the hospital to an inn that housed foreign shinobi who had turned up for the exams until their dying day. That familiar feeling of Kyuubi that had preceded the boy brought back many flashbacks of the terror of that night. When the villagers saw the blazing red eyes with slit pupils, the feral markings where the thin whisker-like lines had been, the elongated fangs, and the claws, they had found themselves wondering how they had thought the small boy with the hopeful blue eyes, whisker lines, and only vaguely sharp teeth who wasn't surrounded by such an impressive killing intent had looked demonic. As the villagers of Konoha were once more reacquainted with true terror, they found themselves relieved when this creature who had up until then been a vaguely hyperactive, loud-mouthed, attention-seeking brat passed them by, and worried that they'd be next when his target ceased to occupy his attention. None of the inn's current occupants moved to stop Naruto as he stormed inside and stomped through its halls. Those from villages that had been blessed or possibly cursed with Jinchuriki knew that attempting to do so would most assuredly be suicide. Baki breathed a sigh of relief when the blonde boy passed by the room his team was occupying without even a second glance, and started pounding on the door of the room of the team from Kusugakure who were packing to leave. The teenager who had opened the door, intending to give the person on the other side a lesson in manners, only caught a glimpse of red, yellow, and orange before the door he was opening slammed into his face. Breaking his nose, his teammate was soon thrown through a wall, which fortunately had been rather thin thanks to the unscrupulous contractors who had been hired to construct the building. The Junin who had been surprised to find a Jinchuriki who bore a faint resemblance to the female student had been saddled with standing in the middle of his team's room went sailing out of the window, his flight being almost terminally halted by the wall of a building across the street. His two students soon followed him out the window, but the paths of their flights went from window to ground. As Naruto yelled down to the stunned and barely breathing team about what he would do to anyone who hurt those who were precious to him, most especially his family, Kakashi and Jiraiya showed up. Jiraiya promptly used a seal to knock the boy out, and Kakashi picked him up and carried him out of the building, past a shell-shocked audience and a rather stunned Iruka. That night, as Naruto was being held in a secure wing of the hospital since nobody knew where else to put him, Kakashi went out to a bar to get completely smashed. He had no idea what the fallout from this day would be, but it would undoubtedly be bad, worse if that Junin who was in critical condition actually died. I am sorry my friend. Guy, who for once wasn't spouting on about youth or setting stupid challenges, said when he approached his rival who was maybe 1 or 2 drinks away from falling off of his bar stool. Fair wa? Kakashi asked. For the loss of your student, Guy said. What do you mean? He asked. Did one of them die while I wasn't looking? Well, after today's incident, the Uzumaki will undoubtedly be removed from your team, Guy replied. Why'd they do that? He asked. They didn't the last time. The last time? Guy asked, aware of the fact that all eyes in the bar were on them. Fortunately, it was a ninja bar, so anything revealed would be staying within the ranks. Back during that cock-up-in wave, Kakashi replied, Ruto though the kid had killed Sasuke, and when bow well, ya know, nuts. Guy stood there and stared at his friend rival, uncertain how to respond. S long s ya don mess wi anyone he cares about, he's fine, Kakashi said as he tossed back the last of his drink, stood up, wobbled, and fell over into Guy who enlisted the help of one of the gate chunin who were also in the bar in order to get Kakashi home. Across town, several academy instructors were quietly getting plastered as they realized how lucky they were that the little landmine they'd been stepping on for years hadn't gone off in their faces. Iruka's apparent kindness towards the Kyuubi's vessel was no longer a point of contention amongst them. As they drank, Iruka found himself remembering a part of the Mizuki incident that had tried to repress, and had almost convinced himself had been a bad dream. You guys remember that scroll incident? Iruka asked. Yeah, what of it? One of the instructors said. Naruto groaned when he awoke and found himself staring at a sterile white hospital ceiling with no memory of how had gotten there. Iruka-sensei had once told him that if he lost something, he should retrace his steps until he found it. Deciding to do that, he went over the last week, or what he could remember of the last week. It had been normal except for the chunin exams, when the first phase had been about to start. Had tried psyching himself up and psyching his opponents out only to end up being kicked out because of that grass nin Karin who had turned out to be a cousin or something. He and Karin had talked for a while before going to get ramen, and then had walked her home. After that, had headed to the Hokage Tower to tell the old man not to hurt Kakashi or Tsuki, but had been stopped when had spotted a little kid running around outside when he should be in bed on the route had taken. By the time had gotten the brat home, and gotten to the tower, the Hokage was busy, and had been sent home. The next morning, had gone to visit Karin in. Oh shit, in the middle of the village. Yeah, that wasn't going to make him any new friends anytime soon, if he ever got out of the hospital that was. Great, just great, and, Karin still felt fuzzy from the painkillers that the Konoha medics had given her. And was only half awake when the nurses came in, chatting, gossiping, checking her vitals, adjusting her IV, and filling her water pitcher. She had forced herself to remain awake in case he visited, but Naruto hadn't returned since he had stormed out the day before, and it looked like he might never return. He was probably disgusted with her for screwing up so badly and being too weak to defend herself from her teammates. As she nearly drifted off once again, she heard one of the nurses mention her cousin's name. Starting, she focused on the conversation that had drifted about her almost completely unheard in hopes of getting more information on her newfound relative. I think it's sweet, scary, but sweet, one of the pair of nurses said as she added water to the vase full of flowers that had been left by her bed. He's just like his great-great-grandfather, the second nurse said as she adjusted the curtains and opened the window. What do you mean? The first nurse asked. You mean you never heard the story about the time the Nadaime got kidnapped? The second nurse asked. No, the first nurse replied. The second nurse then launched into the story of how, back before the founding of Konoha, some minor clan had gotten their hands on Senju Tobirama, and Hashirama had walked in, rescued his little brother, and slaughtered a lot of them. Since the story was so much like the tales that her mother used to tell her every night before she went to sleep, it was no surprise that she fell asleep halfway through the second nurse's tale. And Hinata wandered through the village, despondent and ashamed at her failure. When the pressure was on, she had collapsed like usual. When the 10th question had come around, She had raised her hand and her team had been amongst the number of teams that had fled in droves. Out of the 3 teams from her year's graduating class, only Team 10 had continued on to the second phase. The reason for that was partially due to bad luck on Naruto's part, and partially due to her own weakness. Without Naruto there to bolster her confidence even a tiny bit, she had folded easily. As she wandered through the village, she heard a number of people whispering about Naruto. While that was a normal occurrence, what they were saying wasn't normal. Instead of talking about what a horrible child he was and how he should have been made a ninja, or about one of his latest pranks, or the trouble he'd caused just by existing, they were either talking about yesterday's frankly bizarre incident that had left a large number of her clan trembling in terror, or about how Naruto had supposedly torn one of Karigakure's 7 swordsmen apart with his bare hands for attacking one of his teammates. Another topic that frequently came up which she was reasonably certain wasn't right was Naruto's supposed relation to the Shodai Hokage. She'd been forced to study the Hokage's family trees as part of the history lessons that were part of the lessons she needed as a potential head of the clan, and Naruto's name hadn't been on the Senju family tree anywhere, though the surname Uzumaki had been mentioned a couple of times. "Hey Hinata," a voice called over to her. Looking up in shock since almost nobody outside her clan aside from her teammates spoke to her these days, she saw Sakura waving her over. Confused, she walked over to see what the other girl had wanted. "Hi Sakura-san," she said almost hesitantly when she reached the other girl. If you don't mind my asking, why I stopped to talk to you despite the fact that I completely ignored you at the academy and afterward?" Sakura asked. Hinata was somewhat shocked at how blunt Sakura had been and was reluctant to confirm the statement though it was essentially true. "Things have been nuts at my place since my mother started that silly rumor that Naruto is the Shodai Hokage's grandson's grandson, and well, you're the first classmate I ran into who might be able to help me provide a semi-legitimate excuse for staying away for a while," Sakura replied. And Toby snorted when Head heard the pair of gossiping shinobi who were trading the latest juicy topics to have come out of Konoha behind a sound-dampening genjutsu that had rather easily broken talking about the Kyuubi Jinchuriki's supposed relationship to the Shodai Hokage. As if the closest Naruto got to being related to the Shodai and Nadaime Hokages was through the Shodai Hokage's wife Mito, who was like his mother's third cousin twice removed or something like that. That bastard sensei of his had once shown him a picture of his parents and told him about them back before Head shown his true colors when Head rescued Kakashi and left him for dead under a ton of rocks. Naruto's paternal grandmother had been a flaky blonde with a pair of knockers that rivaled Tsunade's, and Naruto's paternal grandfather had been a neon yellow-haired ditz who had blown himself up while trying to make homemade explosive tags. He was still trying to figure out how the hell the two of them had produced a child as intelligent as Minato-sensei. Based on the reports Head received, killing Naruto could be seen as a mercy kill, since the poor boy had inherited his paternal grandparents' brains and his mother's personality. Had Gaara's father been alive at that point, he would have likely been slamming his head against the nearest solid surface and cursing his stupidity, based on the news about the Kyuubi Jinchuriki that was winging its way across the continent at the speed of rumor which was faster than light. Gaara's uncle had accidentally stumbled upon the perfect way to raise and prime a Jinchuriki, if he could have gotten Gaara to include all of Suna on a list of precious people. As things transpired, the cage was dead in a ditch, though only a few individuals knew that at that point in time, and it was Chio who was laughing at the cruel irony. In Konoha, Baki was stuck with the unenviable task of trying to get a freaked-out Jinchuriki who was having flashbacks to the worst day of his life safely out of the village until it was time for the invasion. The killings in the Forest of Death had done little to sat the boy's bloodlust, and Temari and Konkuro's family resemblance to Yoshimaru wasn't doing them any favors at this point. In Biju that was housed inside Gaara wasn't helping matters any either, apparently being rather afraid of the Biju contained in the blonde Uzumaki and being torn between wanting to run and wanting to attack while it was housed in weak and breakable flesh. Gaara himself was all over the map mentally and emotionally. He ran into someone who was like him for the first time in his life, and rather than being like he was now, the boy was like he had been before his uncle Yoshimaru had. He wanted friends, people he could be close to, but he didn't need precious people in his life. They always betrayed you in the end. Death was how he confirmed his existence. Death was how he kept himself from being betrayed again. When Karin awoke, she sensed the presences of two people in her room. Neither of them were nurses. nor were either of them Naruto, who had yet to make a second appearance since the visit that had ended with him storming out and apparently nearly murdering her team. If the stories she'd been overhearing were true, turning to see who it was who had visited her, she found herself facing two girls who were about Naruto's age, one of whom she recognized as being Naruto's female teammate. The dark-haired girl with the pale eyes who wasn't Naruto's teammate said shyly, having apparently noticed she was awake. "Who are you?" she asked the girls. "I am Sakura and that's Hinata," the pink-haired girl said. "We came to keep you company since Naruto's locked up in the psych ward." "He's what?" "In another area of the hospital entirely." Naruto was sitting in a rather standard-looking office being interrogated by a female Yamanaka who had something of a clinical air about her. She didn't call it interrogation, but the questions she was asking were tortuously invasive. Apparently, that little berserk button of his that he hadn't known existed until Mizuki had tried to kill Iruka-sensei was very dangerous to have, especially considering what he was, and it was her job to fix the problem. Part of this interrogation included going over his past in detail, which was something he generally avoided, partially because if he connected all of those incidents, every last one of those slights, every time had been snubbed, he could very well end up hating Konoha, which was the only home he'd ever known, and the home of most of the few precious people in his life, with a vengeance. "And, how did you feel when the mask stall owner threw you out of his stall and threw the fox mask at you?" the Yamanaka asked, going over yet another detail of that incident with Hibachi that he'd mostly forgotten about until now. Grumbling almost inaudibly, he turned away from his interrogator and focused his gaze on the vase with a single flower in it that rested on the woman's standard-issue desk. The vase was very boring to look at, but it was better than the unwavering gaze of the Yamanaka. Jiraiya sat outside the therapist's office waiting to get a look at the boy who should have already been his student if things had gone according to plan. Had seen the boy when had examined his seal, which was based on an Uzumaki design, and determined that things were as safe as could be expected with a Jinchuriki. But the boy had been unconscious at the time. He wanted to get a feel for the boy, to get to know what kind of child the boy he hadn't seen much of since he was a baby had grown into. By all accounts, Naruto was like his mother, but he wanted to see for himself, to see if there was anything of his former student in the child, to see if Minato had handed down that spark of brilliance that had made him his favorite student aside from Nagato, who was quite possibly kin to the boy as well. If Naruto had indeed inherited that brilliance that caused an off-the-wall tangent to produce actual results, then teaching him would be a joy. He'd barely have to instruct the boy, he'd just have to give him a nudge here or there and the boy would almost independently create something remarkable, or build on and improve something basic in unexpected and previously unimagined ways. It really was a pity he wasn't allowed to teach the boy the sealing arts because of that one incident. That creature that got summoned from that hell dimension was a remarkably good bureaucrat, and document thefts from the census department had been reduced to nearly nil though. In his private office, Danzo sat considering something that went against everything he'd done and built over the past few decades. He was considering building an emotional rapport with a potential trainee and not snuffing it out over training along with all of the child's other emotions. It would be one-sided, with the boy loyal to him, but still. After reviewing the boy's hobbies, he'd thought he'd found an in with the child that would allow him to keep his wallet full and his dignity intact. Outside of work-related activities, the boy enjoyed ramen, pranks, and gardening. He planned on giving the boy a few seedlings for a rare and tricky-to-cultivate plant, then he'd give the boy tips on how to care for the plant, and how the roots needed to be tended to, and excess outgrowth trimmed away. Then, he would slowly open the boy's eyes to the fact that Konoha was like that plant, and that things that seemed reprehensible, things that even standard shinobi tended to be a bit squeamish about, needed to be done to keep it alive. Being loyal to the village, the boy would do the rest in order to keep his precious people, one of whom would be him, safe. Thanks for watching.